The morning sun stretched long shadows across Harvard Yard as Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of the black sedan. His plain military uniform stood out sharply against the ivy-covered buildings around him. The invitation had come 3 weeks early, unusual honor for an African leader, being asked to speak at the Global Leadership Summit. Clusters of students whispered among themselves, their phones already out, recording his arrival. The weight of history sat heavy on his shoulders as he to walk to the same paths once taken by presidents and Nobel Prize winners. Today, he wasn't just here as the leader of Burkina Faso, he was here as the voice of Africa. Inside the grand auditorium, 500 of the world's brightest minds filled the rich mahogany seats. Diplomats, professors and business leaders from 6 continents had gathered for what was being called a landmark event. The chandeliers overhead seemed to judge every word before it was even spoken. As Ibrahim looked around, he noticed a quiet but clear divide. African attendees stuck together, separate from the main conversations. The program had placed him last after all the talks on modern democracy and economic development. The message was clear: Africa could speak, but only after everyone else was done. Dr. Margaret Chen, the summit coordinator, walked up to him with a tense, nervous energy. "President Traoré, we're honored to have you," she said. Her handshake was firm, but quick. "You'll have a 15-minute slot right after Professor Wittmann's keynote on sustainable governance." The time limit stung. Every other speaker had been given at least 30 minutes. She checked her watch with academic precision. "The audience is particularly eager to hear your perspective on challenges facing developing nations," she added. Her carefully worded compliment said everything about how they saw his country. As Ibrahim sat in his reserved front row seat, a familiar fire stirred inside him. This wasn't just a speech to Harvard's elite. This was about shattering decades of polite condescension with truth. The early speakers droned on about abstract theories and dry statistics, never once mentioning the real people behind the numbers. Ibrahim thought of the farmers in Ouagadougou, the students in Bobo-Dioulasso, the mothers in Banfura today. Their voices would be heard in this hallowed space. This was the revolution right here at Harvard. Then came Professor Harrison Wittmann. 3. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked over the room with a well-rehearsed air of authority. At 63, he had made his name with economic theories on failed states and underdeveloped nations. His latest book, The Burden of Governance, had become a bestseller in Western universities. Students clung to his every word, treating his opinions as unquestionable truths. At Harvard, he was nearly a legend in academic circles. To him, today's summit was just another stage to show off his intellectual dominance. Backstage, while reviewing his notes, his assistant whispered something about the African president attending. "Some military guy, Burkina Faso," he muttered, not even bothering to remember Ibrahim's name. His speech focused on how African leaders kept failing their people through corruption and poor governance. The irony escaped him about Africa without once listening to Africans. His PowerPoint was packed with charts of GDP failures and low democracy scores. He had never set foot on African soil, but saw himself as an expert on its problems. As he walked onto the stage, in a sharp suit, his confidence filled the room. The audience clapped politely as he began his talk on sustainable governance in emerging economies. His voice carried the weight of someone who was used to being the smartest person in the room. Within minutes, he was tearing into African leadership with cold, clinical detail. Every statistic he cited painted Africa as broken and incapable. The more his peers nodded in agreement, the more smug he became. About 20 minutes into his presentation, Wittmann noticed Ibrahim sitting calmly in the front row. Something about the young leader's quiet, steady gaze threw him off. He couldn't quite figure out why. Ibrahim showed no reaction, not even a flicker of emotion, as the criticisms kept coming. Not the defensiveness Wittmann had expected, just a calm, focused stare. Ibrahim's face remained calm, his expression one of quiet observation. Wittmann, growing uneasy, felt the urge to push further. He wanted a reaction. Something in his ego demanded recognition from this silent figure, especially from someone he considered beneath him. He wrapped up his presentation with a dramatic pause, clicking to his final slide on leadership accountability. The applause that followed was polite, even enthusiastic, exactly the kind of approval he expected from his academic peers. As the moderator opened the floor for questions, Wittmann's eyes found Ibrahim again. That same calm, unreadable expression had bothered him throughout the talk. It was like an itch he couldn't scratch. And now, he saw the perfect opportunity to assert himself publicly. The room went still as Wittmann leaned back into the microphone. "Before we move on to our next speaker," he said, his voice cutting clean through the quiet, "I feel compelled to address the elephant in the room: African leadership failures." His eyes were locked on Ibrahim. The message was clear. To everyone, this was personal. A hush spread across the hall. People shifted in their seats, sensing the tension thickening. "We have here today," Wittmann continued, "a man who represents exactly the kind of governance challenges I've been discussing." Students began raising their phones again, filming as the moment turned from academic to confrontational. The moderator looked visibly panicked, unsure how to step in. Wittmann's tone grew sharper, louder, more condescending. "Perhaps, Instead of attending Harvard summits, you should go back to Burkina Faso, he mispronounced the country's name, and fix your own house first. The insult hit the room like a slap. A wave of gasps rippled through the audience. Several African diplomats stood up, their faces tight with shock and anger. Wittmann stood behind the podium, clearly pleased with himself. Even some of his supporters looked uncomfortable now, disturbed by the blatant disrespect. The silence that followed was heavy like the moment before a storm. Only the sound of chairs shifting and low murmurs broke the stillness. Ibrahim didn't move. His face stayed neutral, but his knuckles whitened slightly as he gripped the arms of his chair. The moderator fumbled with her microphone, trying to regain control. Cameras zoomed in from all angles, already broadcasting the moment to the world. Wittmann stood smugly, thinking he'd just won some intellectual battle. He had no idea what he'd just provoked. Ibrahim felt all eyes on him. 500 people watching. The professor's words still echoed in the room, but they didn't sting, they lit a fire. His heart beat harder, not from fear, but from a deep, righteous anger. This was a defining moment, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been looked down on. Would he strike back in rage, or rise with purpose? The silence stretched. Each second felt heavy with history. He thought of his ancestors, men and women who had endured worse under colonial rule. He wouldn't dishonor them with bitterness, not today. He would choose dignity over fury, truth over retaliation. The moderator tried again to move things forward, but the room wasn't ready. The audience was frozen, waiting. Then, slowly, Ibrahim stood. His movement was measured and strong like a predator who didn't need to rush. Just the act of rising commanded more respect than everything Wittmann had said. His posture firm, disciplined, unmistakably military, told its own story. This was a man shaped by real battles, not theories. Wittmann's smug grin started to fade. Dr. Chen, Ibrahim said, his voice calm and cutting through the tension like a blade. I believe I was given 15 minutes to speak to this distinguished gathering. His accent blended the musical flow of more with fluent French to English. Every syllable landed with quiet force. The moderator nodded quickly, grateful, relieved, even to have a chance to return control to where it belonged. I'd like to use that time now, if you don't mind. His words were polite, but the tone made it clear it wasn't really a request. The room held its breath, sensing something remarkable was about to unfold. As Ibrahim walked calmly toward the podium, Professor Wittmann reluctantly stepped aside. But he didn't leave the stage. His pride wouldn't let him. Now they stood together, side by side, the privileged academic and the battle-hardened leader. Ibrahim adjusted the microphone with ease, the way someone does when they've addressed entire nations. His eyes swept across the crowd. He didn't just see skeptics or critics, he saw human beings. This wasn't going to be a speech, it would be a reckoning. In the next 15 minutes, he would either validate Wittmann's accusations or reveal them for the ignorance they truly were. Rested his hands gently on the podium, pausing to look out at the audience. The overhead lights cast a soft glow on his face. There was no anger, only a deep, heavy sadness. He took a slow, intentional breath. The silence worked in his favor. You could feel the tension in every corner of the auditorium. Beside him, Wittmann shifted, suddenly realizing he may have misjudged the man he'd tried to embarrass. The audience leaned in. Ibrahim's calm wasn't weakness. It was the stillness before a storm. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice warm and steady, rich with quiet authority. He didn't need to shout. Everyone was already listening. I want to thank Professor Wittmann for his enlightening perspective on African leadership. The pause before enlightening hit harder than any insult ever could. His gaze moved across the room, locking eyes with people from every continent. His invitation for me to go back to Burkina Faso has actually given me the perfect opening. A few people chuckled nervously. They could already see where this was going. Wittmann's smugness faded. His face tightened with uncertainty. Ibrahim reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a speech, it was a photograph. He held it up just long enough for the front rows to see, then set it gently on the podium. This is a picture of my grandmother, he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. Taken in 1960 during our independence celebration. The tone of the room shifted immediately. He wasn't just addressing minds anymore. He was speaking to hearts. She raised me, and she taught me something I'll never forget. When someone shows you who they are, you should listen closely. The audience leaned in further. What started as an academic debate had become something deeply human. People craned their necks to glimpse the photo. The room, once a stage for intellectual performance, now felt more like a courtroom, and truth was about to deliver its verdict. Ibrahim's breathing was calm, his eyes steady. He wasn't fueled by rage, he was powered by purpose. Wittmann fumbled with his notes, starting to realize his casual insult had unleashed something far bigger than he imagined. The cameras were still rolling, but now, they weren't capturing just another conference, they were recording history. Ibrahim's slight smile held no bitterness, just quiet certainty. He knew he held the truth, and he knew it was time to let it speak. The professor suggests I should return to Burkina Faso, he said, repeating the mispronunciation with subtle emphasis. Let me tell you about the Burkina Faso you clearly know nothing about. He gestured to the photograph on the podium. His grandmother's weathered face looked out at the crowd. This woman lived through French colonial rule. She watched her language banned in schools. She saw her culture labeled as primitive. You could hear a pin drop. The audience was completely absorbed, but she taught me something else. That knowledge flows both ways, if you're humble enough to receive it. He looked toward the African diplomats in the room. They nodded quietly, offering strength with their eyes. My country sits on some of the world's richest gold deposits, and yet we were told we were poor. His voice carried no self-pity, only clarity. We grew cotton that fed Europe's textile mills, but our own people wore rags made elsewhere. Wittmann shifted again. The room had clearly turned. The energy was no longer his. Our ancestors built the University of Sankara in Timbuktu, long before Harvard was even a dream. That line settled hard over the hall. The weight of historical truth hung in the silence. You speak of governance failures, Professor, Ibrahim said, still calm but direct, but you ignore the context that created them. His voice didn't waver. He wasn't just defending his country, he was teaching. When colonial powers drew borders through our communities, dividing tribes, separating families, was that good governance? The question hung in the air. He wasn't raising his voice, he didn't need to. When they installed puppet leaders and drained our resources for centuries, was that sustainable development? Students in the audience scrambled to take notes. This wasn't in their textbooks, they knew it. But I didn't come here just to talk about the past, Ibrahim said, his voice rising not in anger, but with conviction. I came to talk about the future we're building despite your low expectations. The year-long deliberate pause was aimed straight at Wittmann, making the professor visibly squirm on stage. We've reduced poverty by 40% in just 2 years, Ibrahim said, using policies your economic theories said were impossible. The statistics hit like thunder. The room stirred, shaken by numbers that challenged everything they thought they knew. Maybe the real question isn't why I should go back, he continued, but why you've never bothered to come and learn. Ibrahim's eyes swept the entire hall, then landed directly on Wittmann's face, which had gone noticeably pale. You've written endlessly about African corruption, Professor, he said, his tone sharp but measured. Yet you've said nothing about the Swiss banks hiding the wealth stolen from us. The accusation was surgical, precise, undeniable. Murmurs spread through the once confident audience. Your theories about failed states, he added, conveniently skip over the institutions that enabled those failures for profit. Several Western diplomats shifted in their seats, discomfort written all over them. The truth had arrived, and it was personal. Tell me, Ibrahim said, pausing for impact, how many Harvard endowment funds benefit from companies that took African resources without fair compensation? The question hung there, sharp and heavy like a blade suspended in midair. You speak of democracy, he continued, while backing dictators who served Western interests for decades. His voice carried lived experience, not just ideology. These weren't theories to him, they were scars. Your government sold weapons to oppressive regimes, he said, and then lectured us about human rights in white papers. The hypocrisy was no longer academic. It was exposed, raw, undeniable. We see your university celebrate diversity, Ibrahim said, his voice unwavering, even as your foreign policies create the very refugees you later turn away. Professor Wittmann's mouth opened, then closed. He had no response. None of his polished theories could protect him now. The energy in the room had shifted completely from quiet confidence to moral confrontation. Your economic models, Ibrahim said, assume we are children, incapable of managing our own resources. Each word tore through decades of paternalistic thinking, the kind that had shaped global policy for generations. But when we try to refine our own gold, he asked, raising an eyebrow, your sanctions appear overnight. The audience began to truly understand they were witnessing something historic. The live dismantling of intellectual colonialism. When we push for fair trade agreements, he said, we're told we lack the expertise to negotiate them. His voice rose clear, steady, and strong. But when we succeed despite your obstacles, he said, we suddenly become a threat to global stability. He paused, letting that truth settle. I find it curious, Ibrahim said, the voice growing colder, that Harvard built on profits from slavery now lectures Africa on how to govern. The line struck the room like a bolt of lightning. Even Wittmann couldn't hide his shock. Your institution's earliest donors, Ibrahim added, bought and sold human beings. While writing essays on liberty and justice, whatever moral high ground had once existed beneath Western academia crumbled as Ibrahim spoke. So before you suggest where I should go, he said, staring directly at Wittmann, maybe you should ask where your authority comes from. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was historic, heavy with centuries of things never said aloud. Even the cameras seemed to pause, as if they understood they were capturing the moment. Western intellectual supremacy met its reckoning. But I didn't come here to prosecute the past, Ibrahim said at last, his voice shifting, no longer an accuser, now a visionary. I came to share the future we're building in Burkina Faso right now. He pulled out his phone, catching the academic audience off guard, a modern gesture during such a formal speech. These aren't statistics from your textbooks, Ibrahim said. These are real people, building real solutions. He tapped the screen. Images appeared: solar farms stretching across the Sahel, classrooms filled with eager children, hospitals treating families in remote villages. We've achieved food self-sufficiency in 3 years, he continued, by trusting our farmers, not foreign consultants. The photos said more than any economic model ever could. Professor Wittmann, he said, with a calm, steady smile, you ask why I don't stay home and fix my country. He paused. There was warmth in his tone, but also steel. This is exactly what we're doing. Without waiting for permission. Without aid dependency. Without your approval. Applause erupted. It started with the African attendees, loud, proud, undeniable. We've built our own pharmaceutical factories, he said. We've cut the cost of medicine by 70%. Every sentence shattered a stereotype. Our youth unemployment has dropped to 15% through programs that teach coding alongside farming and crafts. He kept going. Each success story was another blow to Wittmann's assumptions. We're not asking for charity, Ibrahim said, or sympathy. We're demanding respect and partnership. His voice now filled the hall, not with volume, but with vision. When your companies want our lithium for electric cars, he said, they will negotiate with equals, not subjects. The statement hit hard. Business leaders in the crowd shifted, realizing the old extractive model was over. Our children learn to code in French, he added. We're preserving culture and embracing innovation. He painted a picture of an Africa that knew itself, that stood tall in the world. This, he said, is the leadership you say we lack, building tomorrow while honoring yesterday. Then he opened his arms. I invite you to visit the Burkina Faso you think you know. There was no malice in the invitation. Just truth. A challenge to replace assumptions with real experience. Walk through our innovation hubs, he said. Meet our entrepreneurs. Sit in our democratic councils. His voice softened, but the message deepened. See how we're solving problems that your theories said were unsolvable. Professor Wittmann didn't move. His worldview, built over decades, was falling apart right there on stage. Then tell me, Ibrahim said, if you still think we need to go home to learn governance. He didn't throw down the challenge with anger. He didn't need to. Truth had done the work for him. The first to rise was Dr. Amara Okafor, Nigeria's youngest Harvard PhD. Her chair scraped the floor as she stood, clapping. Her applause echoed through the silent room. Then more students stood. Then, diplomats. The clapping grew louder, rising, rippling through the auditorium like a wave. Even a few Western professors joined in, some surprised, others convicted. Wittmann stood frozen, watching the audience he once commanded turn toward the man he tried to humiliate. Ibrahim remained at the podium, quietly absorbing the unexpected show of solidarity. Soon, half the hall was on its feet. The applause wasn't just for the speech, it was for the courage to speak it. Even Dr. Chen, the summit coordinator, found herself clapping despite every diplomatic instinct telling her to remain neutral. Students pulled out phones, live streams lit up. The moment was already spreading across the world. The applause lasted 3 full minutes. Every second chipped away at Wittmann's credibility. Even European delegates rose, acknowledging the uncomfortable truth in Ibrahim's words. Wittmann's face flushed red. His academic authority, once unshakable, was unraveling in real time. Thank you, Ibrahim said quietly, his voice cutting through the ovation with grace. The room slowly settled, but the air remained electric. I've used my 15 minutes, he said, not to attack but to open a conversation. His tone carried weight. He hadn't just given a response, he had reshaped the entire dialogue. Wittmann stood beside him, trembling with embarrassment. Too stunned to speak, the cameras caught every detail. This wasn't just a speech, it was a moment that would be studied for years. Ibrahim stepped away from the podium. His mission was complete. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't lost his dignity. What began as polite academic applause had become a turning point. Wittmann's insult had backfired in the most spectacular way. The room buzzed, people whispered, texted, replayed what they had just seen. They knew this was history. Within hours, clips of Ibrahim's speech had gone viral. Hashtag Burkina Faso Rising began trending across 6 continents. News channels from Al Jazeera to BBC scrambled to provide context. Harvard's phone lines were jammed with calls demanding Wittmann's resignation. African embassies reported a surge in interest requests for partnerships, cultural exchange, and investment. The 15-minute speech had sparked a global conversation, one about respect, equality, and power. University campuses exploded with debate. Students at Oxford, Sorbonne, and Cambridge held events in support. Wittmann's book sales plummeted. Demand for African authors and scholars soared overnight. Harvard came under pressure to review its African studies curriculum. Suddenly, Wittmann's views were no longer seen as academic, they were seen as outdated. In a single speech, Ibrahim had exposed the fragility of Western academic superiority. World leaders started reaching out to Burkina Faso for partnerships they'd never considered before. Investment offers poured in, not the old extractive kind, but real interest in collaboration. The African Union called Ibrahim's speech a model for diplomatic courage. Even stock markets responded. Confidence rose in African-led development. Wittmann soon announced his early retirement. He never recovered from the public humiliation. The man who told Ibrahim to go back home had, without realizing it, helped launch Africa forward. 3 months later, Ibrahim addressed the United Nations. The applause was thunderous. His Harvard moment had turned him from a regional leader into a global voice for dignity and truth. Applications to African universities rose by 300%. For the first time, Western students were looking to Africa for answers, for education, for partnership. The conversation had shifted. From charity to trade, from aid to respect. Wittmann's insult had awakened something powerful. A continent no longer willing to be lectured by people who refused to listen. Ibrahim Traoré's response didn't just silence his critic, it changed the conversation forever.